We'd sold millions and millions of albums, done sold out thousands of gigs and stuff like that around the world. We still hardly had any money to show for it.
It was one of rock's most enduring partnerships, Geezer Butler and Ozzy Osbourne, bound together by the raw, dark magic that made Black Sabbath a legend. Yet beneath the heavy riffs and sold-out stadiums, tension brewed for years, simmering in backstage corridors and hotel rooms until it finally exploded. Geezer, always the quieter, more thoughtful presence, had kept his frustrations bottled up for decades. But now, the floodgates have opened, and what spills out is not a tale of brotherhood, but instead of betrayal, chaos, and scars that never truly healed. It was as if the same fire that once bound them had turned against them, burning away trust and leaving only smoldering resentment. From there, the transformation began. Once brothers in spirit, now they stood on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield. In the beginning, Ozzy was the scrappy working-class kid from Aston with a raw, untamed voice that could shake the rafters and a flair for chaos that seemed charming at first. Geezer looked at him almost like a younger brother, drawn to his wild charisma and fearless stage presence. But as the band's fame surged, that charm began to rot from the inside. The drugs stopped being a backstage indulgence and became the center of Ozzy's orbit. His life revolved around binges and blackouts. Rehearsals weren't just skipped, they were derailed entirely by his no-shows or his stumbling, incoherent arrivals. Sold-out concerts hung by a thread, with bandmates praying he'd be lucid enough to get through a set. For Geezer, a man who bled into every Sabbath lyric, crafting poetry from shadows and despair, Ozzy's spiral felt like a betrayal of their shared dream. The music they'd built together was constantly under siege by his unpredictable, combustible behavior. What began as creative disagreements morphed into all-out war. Furious arguments that shook the walls, guitars smash, Ed in rage, and insults hurled with venom that could never be taken back. More than once, tempers erupted into physical confrontations, moments where decades of brotherhood threatened to dissolve in a single, violent heartbeat. Outside the music, Ozzy's tangled romantic life created its own storm, one that often rivaled the chaos of his career. His marriage to Sharon Arden would later become one of rock's most infamous unions, a volatile partnership built on ambition, manipulation, and a constant tug-of-war for power. Before Sharon, however, Ozzy's love life was already a minefield of messy affairs, fleeting romances, and reckless flings with groupies that frequently spiraled into public scandal. Each relationship seemed to carry its own trail of gossip, bitter breakups, and whispered betrayals. Some ended in explosive confrontations behind hotel doors, others dissolved into silent grudges that lingered for years.
2 or 3 weeks later, Bill calls me up and says, "Where are you?" I said, "What do you mean, where am I?" He said, we're here to rehearsing. I said, "I thought I was fired."
Geezer saw firsthand how these entanglements bled into the band's dynamics. Jealousies festered, loyalties shifted, and friendships fractured. Ozzy's jealous streak extended far beyond his lovers. Even close friends could become targets if he suspected betrayal. Lovers and companions were often drawn into his personal vendettas, used as pawns in games of control and revenge, leaving a wake of emotional wreckage that further deepened the rifts around him. Ozzy's conflicts weren't limited to Geezer. They spread like wildfire across nearly every corner of his professional life. Within Sabbath, his volatile relationship with Tony Iommi became the stuff of rock folklore. On stage, the chemistry was electric. Offstage, it was an endless clash of egos, tempers flaring over creative control, set lists, and even personal slights. These battles often spilled from rehearsal rooms into after-show parties, sometimes ending with slammed doors or heated walkouts. Beyond Sabbath, Ozzy developed a knack for burning bridges. He clashed with producers over his refusal to compromise, berated promoters when things didn't go his way, and dismissed journalists in explosive interviews that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. By the 1980s, his feuds had metastasized into the wider music world, clashes with fellow rock stars over alleged song thefts, accusations of backstabbing, and perceived disrespect. Some fights erupted publicly in interviews and award show snubs. Others festered in the shadows of green rooms and record label boardrooms. Whether whispered in industry corridors or splashed across the tabloids, they all fed into the same truth. Ozzy had become one of rock's most unpredictable and difficult figures, a man as famous for his conflicts as for his music. Picture this: the lights go out, the amplifiers fall silent, the roaring sea of fans dissolves into the night, and Ozzy is left standing alone, face to face with the shadows that have stalked him for decades. The spectacle, the snarling theatrics, the bizarre onstage antics, none of it could hide the truth. Offstage, there were no costumes, no pyrotechnics, no wall of sound to shield him. What he wrestled with was darker than any Sabbath lyric, more relentless than any touring schedule. His battle wasn't just with fame, it was with himself. Alcohol and hard drugs weren't mere indulgences in the cliché rock and roll lifestyle. They were chains, cold and unyielding, wrapped tight around his life. Every bender was another descent into a place where reason and restraint no longer existed. Each scandal that made its way to the tabloids wasn't a random mishap. It was the public flare-up of a private war spiraling out of control. The headlines painted him as the unhinged Prince of Darkness, but the truth was more tragic. He was drowning, clawing for air in a world he'd built could no longer control. At home, the toll was devastating. The Osbourne household was not a sanctuary. It was a war zone. Violent arguments would erupt like summer storms, sudden and violent, leaving a trail of smashed furniture, broken glass, and words that could never be unsaid. Doors slammed with such force the walls seemed to tremble. Nights passed in tense, icy silence that felt louder than any fight, and through it all, the fracture lines in his marriage grew deeper. Sharon's role was a paradox, part unwavering protector, part combatant in a war neither of them could walk away from. Their love could be fierce and passionate one day, and scorch-earth destructive the next. The children were not spared from the fallout. Periods of estrangement cut through their lives like jagged glass, scattering moments of normalcy into fragments. Birthdays, family dinners, even casual conversations could dissolve into chaos without warning. Fame didn't just cast a shadow, it became a storm cloud that hung permanently overhead. The unpredictability of life with Ozzy meant no one could ever truly relax. Even moments of calm felt like the tense pause before the next eruption. Then came the Osbournes, the reality TV phenomenon that turned their family into household names. The public ate it up. Every bizarre antic, every screaming match, every offbeat moment became primetime comedy. But the cameras didn't capture the full truth. To the outside world, it was eccentric entertainment. To those close enough to see through the cracks, it was a slow-motion implosion. What millions laughed at was, for the family, the documentation of a long-running tragedy, a household held together not by peace, but by the fragile, fraying threads of survival. Even in rare spells of stability, tension hummed in the air like a live wire, ready to snap at the slightest touch. The breaking point didn't arrive quietly. It came crashing down like a door kicked off its hinges. Between Geezer Butler and Ozzy Osbourne, trust hadn't merely faded with time. It had been obliterated, pulverized into something unrecognizable. What began as irritation over missed shows spiraled into something far uglier. The early days, when such mishaps could be brushed off as rock and roll chaos, were long gone. Now, every unexplained disappearance, every last-minute no-show felt like a public humiliation. Geezer wasn't just left holding the pieces. He was left standing under the spotlight, forced to shoulder the shame of a bandmate who seemed determined to sink into his own excesses and drag everyone else down with him. And then came the betrayals that could never be undone. Backroom deals, whispered arrangements, and business moves made in the shadows left Geezer feeling less like a partner and more like a target. Each time Ozzy went behind his back, it wasn't just a breach of trust. It was another blade driven deep into what little was left of their bond. The cuts were deliberate, the wounds slow to heal, if they ever could. Every handshake they offered in public began to feel like theater, hollow gestures masking a festering hostility. The insults were the final nails in the coffin. Some were tossed casually in interviews, others hurled with venom in moments of anger, but all of them landed with the force of a wrecking ball. These weren't harmless jabs between old friends. They were precision strikes meant to wound, to remind the other that the days of loyalty and mutual respect were over. By the time they took the stage together for their much-publicized reunions, the damage was irreversible. The grins they flashed for the cameras were brittle, their eyes cold. Every photo op was a performance, every on-stage embrace a silent lie told for the sake of the brand. Backstage, the truth could no longer be disguised. Their words to each other were clipped and transactional, as if they were negotiating terms rather than sharing a life's work. The air between them was dense, heavy with years of unspoken grievances and the echo of too many betrayals. And now, as Geezer strips away the facade, fans are confronted with a reality that stings. These weren't two brothers in arms holding the line for heavy metal. They were strangers chained together by a once mighty legacy, dragging it forward not out of love, but out of obligation to a history that had already been fractured beyond repair. The golden aura that has long wrapped itself around the name Black Sabbath, glowing like a sacred relic in rock history. This was the band that ripped open the gates of heavy metal, birthing an entirely new sound that would echo through stadiums, bedrooms, and rebellious hearts for decades. They were gods on stage, their riffs the gospel of a generation. But peel back that shimmering veneer, and what you find is not a harmonious brotherhood. It's a battlefield, a silent war zone, littered with unspoken betrayals, sharp words never forgotten, and the heavy, suffocating weight of grudges that refuse to die. Ozzy Osbourne's scandals, some outrageous, others downright self-destructive, were not harmless rock and roll escapades. They were grenades tossed into the very foundations of Sabbath's unity. Every public feud, every outburst, every unpredictable stunt didn't just cast a passing shadow. It carved deep, jagged scars into the band's once pristine legacy. What should have been a saga of solidarity and artistic immortality began to twist into something darker, a cautionary tale of how fame, unchecked indulgence, and buried resentments can rot a legacy from the inside out. Even the so-called reunions, the triumphant tours, the glossy press photos, the staged moments of camaraderie were more fragile than anyone dared admit. Behind those smiles were gritted teeth. Behind those handshakes were clenched fists hidden in the pockets. They were ceasefires, not peace treaties. Temporary truces perched on a razor's edge, ready to collapse under the slightest tremor of ego or bitterness. And now, with Geezer Butler pulling back the curtain, there is no denying it. Sabbath's place in music history is secure, but the myth of their unshakable brotherhood has crumbled into dust. Yes, they remain titans, immortal in sound, but that immortality carries with it a haunting shadow, one of fractured trust, wasted opportunities, and friendships that could never quite survive the storm they themselves created.